December 4th, 1944. Western Europe, winter tightening its grip. By every known rule of warfare, the war in the West was entering its final act. The German army was bleeding out, its cities were burning. Its fuel depots were empty. Its divisions were shattered shadows of what they had once been. Allied columns rolled forward almost unopposed, their commanders already planning Christmas dinners and victory parades. History insists this should have been the end. And yet, on this day, one American general stood before a wall-sized map and felt something tightening in his chest. Not relief, not triumph, fear. His name was George S. Patton. Outside, snow dusted the roads of Luxembourg. Inside 3rd Army headquarters, the atmosphere was complacent, almost careless. Staff officers spoke in confident tones. Reports described a beaten enemy retreating toward the Rhine. Intelligence estimates agreed with each other to a frightening degree. Germany, they said, no longer possessed the strength to strike back. Patton listened and said nothing. Then he stepped forward. He raised his hand and stabbed a finger into a dark, wooded region on the map, the Ardennes Forest, a place the Allies barely discussed anymore. A quiet sector, thinly held. Assigned to inexperienced divisions precisely because nothing was supposed to happen there. Patton's voice cut through the room. "They're going to hit us here." The words landed badly. No rational commander would attempt this. The terrain was terrible. The roads were narrow, the weather was unpredictable, German logistics were already collapsing. To launch a major offensive now would be suicide, that was the logic. Patton rejected it. He spoke of silence, radio silence. Of divisions that had vanished from Allied tracking, of rail traffic moving only at night, of a stillness that felt wrong, the kind of stillness that comes before violence. His intelligence officers shifted uncomfortably. They had charts, they had numbers. None of them supported what Patton was saying. One officer finally spoke. "Sir, there's no evidence of a large-scale enemy buildup in that sector." Patton didn't look at him. "Then you're not looking hard enough." This was the burden Patton carried. His career had been built not on consensus, but on instinct sharpened by obsession. He studied enemy commanders the way other men studied prayer books. He believed wars were decided not by averages, but by extremes, by the single moment when someone did the unthinkable. And in December 1944, Adolf Hitler was running out of thinkable options. Across the Allied front, optimism had become doctrine. At Supreme Headquarters, planners spoke openly of Germany's collapse. General Dwight Eisenhower's staff believed the enemy could do little more than delay the inevitable. Field commanders pushed forward, stretching supply lines, rotating exhausted units, confident the worst was behind them. The Ardennes became a backwater, a place to rest divisions, a place to recover, a place no one was watching, except Patton. He remembered 1940. He remembered how the French had dismissed the Ardennes as impassable until German armor poured through it and broke an entire nation in weeks. He remembered that arrogance had a pattern, and that patterns repeat when men convince themselves history cannot happen again. Patton began preparing anyway, quietly, almost secretly. He ordered contingency plans drawn up, plans to pivot his entire 3rd Army north if disaster struck. His staff thought it was theoretical, an intellectual exercise to satisfy their commander's paranoia. They did not believe they would ever be used. Patton believed they would be needed soon. At night, he walked alone through headquarters corridors, listening to the distant hum of generators. He reread reports others had already dismissed. He traced German movements with a pencil over and over until the paper wore thin. By every metric that mattered to Allied intelligence, the Germans were finished. By every instinct Patton possessed, they were about to gamble everything. And if they struck through the Ardennes, the consequences would be catastrophic. Thin American lines would snap. Entire divisions could be encircled. Supply depots would fall intact into enemy hands. The Allied advance could be split in two. Antwerp, vital, irreplaceable, might be lost. It was a nightmare scenario. It was also, Patton believed, exactly the kind of nightmare Hitler would choose. 10 days later, on December 16th, the forest would erupt. German tanks would emerge from the mist. Artillery would tear through frozen ground. Thousands of American soldiers would wake to an apocalypse they had been told was impossible. But on December 4th, none of that had happened yet. The maps were still clean, the lines still straight, the silence still intact, and one man stood alone watching it, knowing that silence was the most dangerous sound of all. December 7th, 1944, 3 days after Patton's warning. At Allied headquarters, the mood bordered on celebratory. Maps were crowded with arrows pushing east. Schedules were being drafted not for battles but for endings. Commanders spoke of river crossings, occupation zones, and post-war Europe. No one spoke of disaster. By every known rule of warfare, the enemy no longer had a move left. German industry lay in ruins. Allied bombers roamed the skies uncontested. Fuel shortages had immobilized entire enemy formations. Prisoners taken along the front told the same story: exhaustion, hunger, collapse. Intelligence summaries reinforced what everyone wanted to believe: Germany could not attack even if it wanted to. And wanting, they assumed, was irrelevant. At the center of this confidence stood Dwight D. Eisenhower, calm, methodical, and burdened with managing the largest coalition army in history. Eisenhower trusted systems. He trusted consensus. And every system under his command agreed on one thing: the Ardennes was quiet because it was dead. Reports from British intelligence echoed American conclusions. German units were assessed as incapable of coordinated action. Any counterattack, if attempted at all, would be local, limited, and short-lived. Patton read those reports with growing unease. Silence, he believed, did not mean weakness. It meant concealment. German radio traffic had dropped to almost nothing in the Ardennes sector. To most analysts, this confirmed collapse. To Patton, it was a warning. Armies preparing to strike do not announce themselves. They disappear. He pressed his intelligence staff harder. Where were the armored divisions last seen near the Rhine? Why were rail movements increasing at night? Why were entire formations missing from updated enemy orders of battle? The answers were unsatisfying, unverifiable, inconclusive. That was the problem. Modern warfare depends on data, on patterns, on predictability. And Patton was arguing for something deeply uncomfortable: intuition over information. Psychology over spreadsheets. He believed Adolf Hitler was not thinking like an accountant. He was thinking like a gambler who had already lost everything. Behind the German lines, that gamble was already underway. Entire divisions were being stripped from quieter fronts. Fuel was being hoarded at the expense of all other operations. Panzer units moved only after dark, hidden beneath forest canopies and winter fog. Soldiers were ordered to absolute radio silence, punished severely for even minor breaches. This was not the behavior of an army preparing to defend. It was the behavior of an army preparing to lunge. And yet, at Allied planning tables, Patton's warnings were increasingly seen as an inconvenience. Some believed his aggressive nature had warped his judgment. Others suspected he wanted attention or feared being sidelined as the war entered its final phase. A few quietly worried he was right, but saw no way to convince the system to listen. Because systems reward certainty, not doubt, Patton's proposals were dismissed as speculative. His contingency plans were acknowledged politely, then filed away. No reinforcements were shifted. No defenses strengthened. The Ardennes remained thinly held by green divisions with little combat experience. History insists this should have been enough. After all, why would Germany attack into the strongest coalition army the world had ever assembled, at the exact moment that coalition believed the war was already won? The answer was simple: because the Allies believed it. As days passed, winter storms rolled in, snow-blanketed roads, ice-clogged rivers, aircraft were grounded by cloud cover. Allied air superiority, the single greatest advantage in the West, was temporarily neutralized. Patton noticed, bad weather did not slow an attacker who planned for it. It blinded a defender who depended on the sky. On December 10th, Patton attended another high-level briefing. Once again, he raised the Ardennes. Once again, the room cooled. He spoke calmly now, his earlier urgency replaced by something darker. If they hit us, he said, it will come fast, and it will come hard. No one challenged him openly, no one acted either. The tragedy of foresight is not being wrong, it is being right too early. When warnings arrive before fear, they are treated as noise. The forest remained quiet. American soldiers rotated into the line expecting rest. Some wrote letters home, some slept without boots. Outposts were undermanned, artillery was dispersed. Across the line, German forces completed their final preparations. The attack had a name: Wachtem Rhein, watch on the Rhine. By December 15th, everything was in position. The silence Patton feared had reached its peak, and in war, silence does not mean peace, it means the clock has reached zero. December 16th, 1944. 5:30 hours. The world did not end with a warning. It began with silence, thick, frozen, absolute, followed by a sound so violent it tore sleep from the bones of every man in the Ardennes. German artillery erupted along an 80-mile front. By every known rule of warfare, this should not have been possible. The guns fired in coordinated waves. Thousands of shells slammed into American positions that had not been reinforced, not dug in, not prepared for mass assault. Communications lines were severed in minutes. Command posts vanished in fire and splintered timber. Men woke to hell, some never woke at all. The Ardennes, dismissed, neglected, written off, had become the focal point of the largest German offensive since 1940. Infantry surged forward under the cover of darkness and fog. Panzer columns followed narrow forest roads, engines muffled, headlights off, snow swallowed sound, smoke swallowed direction. American units holding the line were thin. In some sectors, companies were stretched across miles. Many soldiers were new, some had never been under fire. They had been told this sector was safe. History insists they should have been right. They were catastrophically wrong. German assault groups infiltrated through gaps no one had bothered to close. Road junctions were seized before headquarters even realized the attack was real. Entire battalions were surrounded in the first hours. Confusion spread faster than orders could be issued. By sunrise, the impossible was undeniable. The Germans were not probing, they were not bluffing, they were not launching a desperate raid. They were executing a full-scale offensive. Behind it all stood Adolf Hitler, betting what remained of his army on one final throw of the dice. His objective was audacious to the point of madness: break through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, seize Antwerp, and split the Allied coalition in half. If it worked, the war in the West would be thrown into chaos. If it failed, Germany would die anyway. This was not strategy, it was compulsion. And it was working. American headquarters struggled to understand the scale of what was happening. Early reports were dismissed as exaggerations, then as localized crises, then as system failures. Only later did the truth emerge. The German 6th Panzer Army, elite, fanatical, and previously unaccounted for, was driving straight through the heart of the Ardennes. Fuel shortages had been ignored, casualties were irrelevant, speed was everything. American units fought where they stood, some held for hours, some for days. Others were crushed before they could react. Roads became choked with refugees, retreating troops wrecked vehicles. Winter made everything worse. Wounded men froze before medics could reach them. Vehicles slid into ditches and blocked vital supply routes. Artillery crews fired until barrels cracked, then kept firing anyway. Orders contradicted each other. Maps became obsolete within hours. The Allied front began to bend. Then it began to bulge. At 3rd Army headquarters, the news arrived in fragments: broken transmissions, panicked couriers, incomplete situation reports. But the pattern was unmistakable. The nightmare had arrived exactly where it had been predicted. Patton did not celebrate. He did not say, "I told you so," he swore, because being right did not mean being ready yet. The German breakthrough threatened to unravel everything. If they reached the Meuse, the Allied advance would fracture. If they took Antwerp, millions of tons of supplies would be lost. Entire armies could be isolated. Time was running out. And now the burden shifted. Foresight alone was no longer enough. The question was no longer whether Patton had been right. The question was whether he could move fast enough to stop what everyone else had failed to see, because the forest had spoken, and it was still advancing. December 17, 1944. Less than 24 hours after the guns opened. At Allied headquarters, disbelief gave way to panic. Maps were redrawn in real time. Front lines dissolved faster than ink could dry. Reports contradicted each other, then escalated. German armor was deeper than expected. American units were missing. Entire sectors had gone silent. By every rational standard of command, the situation was already out of control. And then the unthinkable question was asked. Could 3rd Army turn north, not reinforce, not delay, turn? Omar Bradley convened his senior commanders under crushing pressure. The German penetration was widening by the hour. Bastogne, a critical road hub, was nearly surrounded. If it fell, the Germans would gain operational freedom across the Ardennes. Someone needed to move immediately. Patton was ready. He had been ready before the first shell fell. While others scrambled to improvise, Patton calmly opened a folder and laid 3 contingency plans on the table. Each outlined a full pivot of 3rd Army 90 degrees northward under winter conditions while still engaged with the enemy to the east. Silence filled the room. By every known rule of warfare, this was madness. Armies do not simply turn, not in contact, not in winter, not across clogged roads under constant threat of air and artillery attack. It should have taken weeks. Patton said it would take days. Bradley stared at him. When can you attack? Patton did not hesitate. 3 days. Some officers thought he had misspoken. Others thought he was lying to inspire, to intimidate, to force a decision. No one believed the timetable was realistic. Patton did not care. He understood something the moment demanded. Speed was not an advantage, it was survival. Every hour Bastogne remained under threat tightened the German grip. Every delay allowed enemy armor to consolidate and expand the bulge. Orders went out immediately. Divisions disengaged under pressure, wheeled north, and began moving through snow-choked roads in temperatures that froze engines solid. Traffic jams stretched for miles, trucks broke down, men marched when vehicles failed. Officers used pistols to clear intersections when military police could not keep up. The pivot began. This was not elegant warfare. It was brute force logistics driven by will. Commanders slept in vehicles. Staff officers worked until their hands bled from cold. Engineers worked through the night repairing bridges under blackout conditions, and somehow it held together. The Germans did not expect it. They believed Allied command was paralyzed. They assumed confusion would buy them time. Instead, they watched in disbelief as an entire army repositioned itself with impossible speed. At the center of the storm was Bostonia. American airborne troops, cut off, surrounded, and freezing, held the town under relentless assault. German demands for surrender were met with a single-word reply that would become legend: nuts. But legend hides the reality. Inside Bostonia, men were running out of ammunition, wounded lay untreated. Artillery shells fell day and night, the perimeter shrank, the pressure mounted, relief had to come soon. Patton's spearheads drove north through sleet and snow, advancing into uncertainty. They did not know what resistance awaited them. They did not know if Bostonia could hold. They only knew failure was not an option. History insists this maneuver should have collapsed under its own weight. That roads should have jammed beyond recovery. That units should have arrived piecemeal and been destroyed in detail. Instead, the gamble December 20th, 1944. The Ardennes was no longer a bulge. It was a wound. At its center lay Bostonia, a road junction so ordinary it should never have mattered, except that every major artery in the region ran through it. Whoever controlled Bostonia controlled movement. Fuel, reinforcements, time. The Germans understood this, so did the Americans trapped inside it. Encircling the town were elements of Germany's armored spearheads, tightening their grip with each passing hour. Inside were exhausted paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, supported by scattered tank and artillery units that had been swallowed by the German advance. They were surrounded, cut off, freezing. By every rule of warfare, Bostonia should have fallen. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Snow filled foxholes faster than men could clear them. Medical supplies ran out. Morphine was rationed. Bandages were reused. Some wounded froze to death before help arrived. German artillery pounded the town day and night. Buildings collapsed into cellars filled with civilians and soldiers alike. Smoke choked the air. Ammunition stocks dwindled with every attack repelled. Then came the demand. A German delegation approached under a white flag and delivered an ultimatum: surrender or be annihilated. The American reply was brief, defiant, and deeply human. But defiance does not stop tanks. Every hour Bostonia held was another hour the German timetable slipped, and another hour Patton's relief column fought the roads north. But relief was not guaranteed. Snowstorms grounded aircraft. Supplies could not be dropped. Radio contact was sporadic. Inside the perimeter, commanders prepared for the worst. They knew what encirclement meant. They had studied the Eastern Front. They knew what happened when surrounded forces ran out of food, ammunition, and hope. Yet they held, not because victory seemed possible, but because surrender felt worse. Outside Bostonia, German momentum began to strain. Fuel shortages worsened. American resistance stiffened along the shoulders of the bulge. Patton's attack was no longer theoretical. It was pressing into German flanks, forcing redeployments that Hitler's plan could not afford. The gamble was unraveling. Still, Bostonia was not safe. On December 22nd, German attacks intensified. Infantry assaults followed armor assaults. Artillery fire became constant. The perimeter bent but did not break. Patton drove his commanders relentlessly. Don't let up, he told them. Every mile matters. History insists this moment balanced on a knife's edge. If Bostonia fell before relief arrived, German forces would regain freedom of movement. The bulge would expand. Allied losses would skyrocket. The narrative of inevitable victory would shatter. If it held just long enough, the entire German offensive could collapse under its own weight. By December 23rd, the skies finally began to clear. Allied aircraft roared overhead for the first time since the offensive began. Supplies rained down. Wounded were evacuated. German columns were strafed along frozen roads. Hope returned not as confidence but as breath. Patton's lead elements were close now. Fighting intensified as they pushed through stubborn resistance, losing men with every mile gained. Tanks burned. Infantry advanced through snow stained dark with blood. Then on December 26th, contact was made. The siege was broken. Bostonia still stood, but the battle was far from over. The German offensive had been checked but not destroyed. Hitler still demanded success. German units regrouped, desperate to salvage something from the gamble that was slipping away, and winter still ruled the battlefield. The question now was not whether the Allies would survive. It was how much blood the Ardennes would demand before it was finished. December 27, 1944, the relief of Bostonia did not end the battle, it only changed its shape. By every known rule of warfare, the Germans should have broken contact and withdrawn. Their offensive had stalled. Fuel was nearly gone. Casualties were irreplaceable. Allied air power had returned to the skies with merciless clarity. But wars do not end when logic demands. They end when one side can no longer endure. Hitler ordered the attack to continue. German units pressed forward in places even as others fell back. The Ardennes became a grinding, frozen cauldron, counterattacks slamming into counterattacks, villages changing hands multiple times in a single day. Snow hid the dead. Shellfire unearthed them again. The Allies now faced a different danger. Confidence with Bostonia relieved, some commanders believed the crisis had passed. They spoke of stabilizing lines, of wearing the enemy down, of letting German desperation finish the job. Patton disagreed. He saw what others missed again. The bulge still existed. German forces were battered but not yet broken. If given time, they could consolidate, shorten their lines, and withdraw in good order. That would preserve fighting strength for the inevitable defense of Germany itself. Patton wanted annihilation. He pushed Third Army forward relentlessly, accepting losses that made staff officers flinch. His men were exhausted, frostbitten, and fighting in conditions that made every movement an act of suffering. Tanks refused to start, weapons jammed, men slept standing up, and still he drove them. Because Patton understood something uncomfortable, being right did not make him popular, it made him responsible. North of the Bulge, British forces under Bernard Montgomery stabilized the line near the Meuse. The danger of a German breakthrough toward Antwerp faded, but coordination between Allied commands was tense. Egos clashed. Credit was debated even as men died. The enemy did not care. German units fought on with the knowledge that this was the last chance. Some were ordered forward with barely enough fuel to move once. Others were told bluntly there would be no retreat. This was not strategy anymore. It was attrition fueled by delusion. Villages like Foy, Manhay, and Houffalize became killing grounds. American and German soldiers fought house to house, cellar to cellar, often unable to tell friend from foe through swirling snow and smoke. No one felt victorious. Patton's instincts had saved the Allied front, but they had also condemned thousands to die in order to seal that salvation. He knew it, he carried it. He did not soften it with speeches. History often rewards foresight with praise. In reality, it rewards it with weight. As January approached, the German offensive finally collapsed into retreat. Fuel trucks were abandoned, tanks were blown up by their own crews. Wounded were left behind in the snow. The Ardennes, once quiet, was now a graveyard. The Bulge began to shrink, but the cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of casualties. Entire towns destroyed. Soldiers who would never return home on either side. The largest battle the United States Army had ever fought was ending not with triumph but exhaustion. Patton stood on ground he had feared weeks earlier and said little. He had seen it coming, he had acted. And still too many had died, because foresight does not prevent catastrophe, it only decides how bad it becomes. The Ardennes offensive was finished, but its meaning was not. And the final judgment of Patton's warning, why it mattered, why it was ignored, and what it reveals about war itself, still waited to be reckoned. January 1945. The snow began to melt. What it revealed beneath was not victory, but evidence. Burned-out tanks lined frozen roads like monuments to miscalculation. Villages that had existed for centuries were reduced to timber and ash. Bodies emerged from shallow graves where comrades had buried them quickly, knowing the ground would soon be too hard to dig. The Ardennes offensive was over. And only now, after the cost was paid, did the questions begin. Why had the warning been dismissed? Why had one man seen what entire intelligence systems had not? By every modern doctrine of warfare, the Allies had done everything right. They collected data. They shared intelligence. They compared estimates across nations and commands. They trusted consensus. And that was the flaw. Consensus does not predict the abnormal. It smooths it away. German defeat had become an assumption, not a hypothesis. Every report was interpreted through that lens. Evidence that did not fit was downgraded, delayed, or dismissed. Silence was read as weakness. Desperation was mistaken for collapse. Patton did not analyze Germany as a spreadsheet. He analyzed it as a mind under pressure. He understood that rational actors do not always behave rationally when facing extinction. That history's most dangerous moments come not when one side is strong, but when it is cornered. This was the truth Allied intelligence could not quantify. They measured fuel reserves. Patton measured intent. They counted divisions. Patton counted psychology, and when the two conflicted, he trusted the latter. But foresight without authority is fragile. Patton could warn, he could prepare his own command, but he could not force belief. Military systems, especially coalition systems, moved deliberately, cautiously, and only on overwhelming evidence. By the time evidence arrived, it arrived as artillery fire. The Battle of the Bulge would later be studied as a failure of imagination. Not because the Allies lacked information, but because they lacked permission to believe the worst. After the war, reports would acknowledge the oversight. Analysts would point to missed indicators, fragmented intelligence, and cognitive bias. Training manuals would be rewritten. Lessons would be learned. But those lessons were paid for in blood. For Patton, there was no satisfaction. Being right did not spare him the funerals. It did not warm the men who froze in foxholes. It did not rebuild the towns erased in the fighting. It simply meant he had lived with the knowledge, weeks earlier, that this pain was coming. History often celebrates generals for bold attacks and decisive victories. It rarely honors the ones who tried to stop disasters before they began. Because prevention has no parade, the Ardennes would fade back into forest. New growth would cover shell holes. Roads would be rebuilt. Tourists would one day walk the same ground where armies froze and died, but the pattern would remain. Wars would continue to punish those who assume inevitability, those who believe momentum replaces vigilance, those who forget that enemies get a vote, especially when they have nothing left to lose. Patton's warning was not remarkable because it was accurate. It was remarkable because it was lonely. And in war, loneliness is often the price of seeing clearly. One part remains, not about Patton, but about what the Battle of the Bulge ultimately tells us, about history, about certainty, and about how close the war in the West came to turning in those frozen weeks. February 1945, the Ardennes was quiet again. Snow melted into mud. Mud hardened into road. The forest that had swallowed armies returned to silence as if nothing had happened. But the Western Front moved forward carrying a memory it could not erase. By every known rule of warfare, the Battle of the Bulge should not have changed the outcome of the war. Germany still lost. Berlin still fell. Yet history is not only shaped by outcomes, it is shaped by margins. The Ardennes offensive came closer to success than Allied confidence ever allowed itself to imagine. Fuel captured in the opening days nearly sustained German spearheads long enough to reach the Meuse. Weather delayed air power at precisely the wrong moment. Thin American lines bent dangerously close to rupture. Had Bostonia fallen sooner, had Third Army turned slower, had German fuel lasted days longer, the war in the West would not have ended in defeat for the Allies, but it would have ended differently, with far greater loss. With shattered trust between coalition partners, with months added to a war already soaked in blood, this was the cost of certainty. Patton's foresight did not win the Battle of the Bulge alone. Tens of thousands of soldiers, American, British, Belgian, German, paid for that victory with endurance, suffering, and death. But his warning mattered because it reminds us of something uncomfortable. Wars are not decided only by strength. They are decided by imagination, the ability to envision catastrophe before it arrives.